All right, so have you ever wondered how something like a receipt or even a stray hair can send someone to jail?
It's fascinating, isn't it? The power of evidence in legal cases.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're diving deep into today, the world of legal evidence. You guys have sent in so many questions about this, wanting to know how evidence is actually gathered, how it's categorized, and ultimately how it can make or break a case.
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of people have this sort of Hollywood image of evidence, just focusing on fingerprints and DNA.
Right, like it's all just CSI.
Exactly. But in reality, evidence is a much broader concept. It basically covers anything that can be presented in court to either prove or disprove facts.
So it's not just about finding that smoking gun.
Nope, not at all. Think about it. We've got witness testimonies, contracts, emails, medical records, security footage, you name it. Even a social media post that goes viral could become a key piece of evidence in a case.
Wow, okay. So we're talking about a way wider range of things than I initially imagined. So how do legal teams even begin to organize all this potential evidence?
Well, one way to think about it is to categorize evidence based on its source. So, broadly speaking, we've got three main categories: forensic evidence, documentary evidence, and then witness testimony.
Okay, let's break those down. Starting with forensic evidence, this is where things get really interesting, right? This is the CSI stuff.
Exactly. Forensic evidence is all about using scientific analysis to examine evidence. We're talking about things like DNA profiling, fingerprinting, ballistics, which is the study of firearms, and even digital forensics.
So this is where science really takes center stage in a case.
Absolutely. And it can be incredibly powerful. Take the Nirbhaya case in India, for example. The DNA evidence played a crucial role in getting those convictions.
Yeah, that case was horrific, but it really felt like a turning point in how seriously forensic science was taken in India.
Absolutely. That case, along with others like the Jessica Law case, where ballistic evidence was key, really pushed for better infrastructure and standardized protocols in Indian forensic labs.
It makes sense. You need the right tools and the right expertise to get accurate results.
Okay, so that's forensic evidence. What about situations where the evidence isn't so, physical? How does documentary evidence work?
Well, documentary evidence is basically anything that documents an event or an interaction. So think about things like contracts, emails, medical records, security footage. Even think about like that text message argument you had last week. Technically, that could be considered documentary evidence.
So our digital footprint can become evidence too.
Precisely. And that's where digital forensics comes in. You've got these experts who can recover deleted files, analyze metadata, and trace online activity.
Wow, that's both amazing and a little bit scary. Really makes you think about what you leave behind online.
It definitely highlights the importance of being responsible with your digital life. Okay, and last but not least, we've got witness testimony. This seems pretty straightforward on the surface, people just telling their side of the story. But I'm guessing it's not always that simple.
You're right. Witness testimony can be surprisingly complex. You have to remember that human memory is pretty unreliable. It can be influenced by things like stress, trauma, even the way a lawyer phrases a question.
So even if a witness is trying to be truthful, their testimony might not be entirely accurate.
Exactly. And that's why witness testimony is often considered less reliable than other types of evidence, especially if there isn't any other evidence to support it.
This is all so fascinating. Okay, so we've got these different types of evidence, but how do we know what actually makes it into the courtroom? It can't just be a free-for-all, right?
You're absolutely right. Not all evidence is allowed in court. There are rules, and a judge acts as a gatekeeper to decide what's admissible and what's not.
So what are the criteria for something to be admissible? Is there like a checklist?
Think of it as a four-factor test. First, the evidence needs to be relevant, meaning it has to directly relate to the case at hand. And then second, it has to have been obtained legally. If it wasn't, it could be thrown out under what's called the exclusionary rule.
The exclusionary rule, that rings a bell.
Yeah, basically it means that if evidence is obtained illegally, let's say through an unlawful search, then it can't be used against the defendant in court. It's a really important safeguard for our rights.
That makes sense. Okay, so what about the other two factors?
The other two are all about reliability and credibility. So we're asking, is the science behind the evidence sound? Are the experts who analyzed it qualified and credible? And can the source of the evidence be trusted?
This reminds me of all those crime shows where they talk about the chain of custody. Does that fall under reliability?
Absolutely. The chain of custody is this really detailed record that tracks how evidence was handled from the moment it was collected all the way to when it's presented in court. Any gaps or mishandling in that chain can make the evidence seem less reliable and could even lead to it being excluded.
So if, say, a detective forgets to sign a log when transferring evidence, that could potentially mess up the whole case.
It's possible, yeah. That's how important these procedures are. But even when evidence is deemed admissible, it doesn't automatically mean the jury's going to believe it.
Wait, so even if a judge says a piece of evidence is allowed, the jury can still choose to disregard it?
Yep, they can, and they often do. They have to weigh the evidence that's presented and decide how convincing they think it is.
Man, this is way more complex than I realized. So we've got the different categories of evidence, how it's deemed admissible, and now we're talking about the weight of evidence.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's still so much more to explore, like the role of expert witnesses, the impact of media on public perception, and of course, all the ethical considerations around using certain types of evidence.
This really is a deep dive, and I'm already hooked. We'll definitely have to continue this conversation.
Absolutely. There are tons more twists and turns in the world of legal evidence, and we'll be unpacking them all in this deep dive.
So it sounds like evidence is kind of like the building blocks of a legal case, but it's not just about like stacking them up, it's about how they all fit together, right? And how much weight they carry and even how they're presented.
Exactly. It's fascinating how much strategy goes into using evidence effectively in court. Lawyers, they're not just presenting facts, they're crafting a narrative. They're trying to influence how the jury sees the whole story.
It's almost like a performance then, like a carefully choreographed dance. Speaking of performance, you mentioned expert witnesses earlier. What role do they play in all of this?
Oh, expert witnesses are crucial. They're specialists who bring their knowledge and expertise to help the jury understand complex evidence. Think of them as translators, kind of bridging the gap between, say, a really complicated scientific analysis and the everyday people on the jury.
So, if there's DNA evidence, the prosecution might bring in a forensic scientist to explain what the DNA analysis shows, how it was done, and why it's relevant to the case.
Precisely. They're not there to say whether they think the defendant is guilty or innocent, but to provide that really important scientific or technical context. And of course, the defense can also bring in their own expert witnesses to challenge the prosecution's findings or offer a different interpretation.
This is making me think about those courtroom scenes you see in movies where lawyers are grilling expert witnesses, trying to discredit them or find holes in their testimony. Is that basically what cross-examination is?
Yes, cross-examination is a key part of our legal system. Both sides get a chance to question the other side's witnesses, to challenge their expertise, point out any inconsistencies in what they're saying, and basically try to influence how the jury views their testimony.
It's like a battle of wits then, with the lawyers trying to control the narrative and shape how the jury understands the evidence. This makes the whole idea of the weight of evidence even more important, right? How convincing the jury finds the evidence could really sway the case one way or the other.
Oh, absolutely. You can think of it like a scale. Each piece of evidence that's admitted is like a weight on one side or the other. And the side with the heavier side, the more convincing evidence, is often the side that wins. But it's not just about the quantity of evidence, it's about the quality and how it's presented.
So a single really strong piece of evidence could actually outweigh a ton of weaker, less convincing evidence.
Exactly. A really strong piece of forensic evidence, for instance, can be incredibly persuasive. Think back to the Nirbhaya case and the Jessica Lowell case we were talking about earlier. The DNA and ballistic evidence in those cases, they were instrumental in securing those convictions.
Yeah, it's clear that evidence can have a huge impact on the outcome of a case. It's not just some theoretical thing. It has real-world consequences. But what about situations where the evidence itself is flawed or misinterpreted? We've seen those stories too, haven't we?
Unfortunately, yes. Our legal system isn't perfect, and there have been cases where things like faulty forensic analysis, a break in the chain of custody, or even deliberate misconduct have led to wrongful convictions. It's a reminder that we can't just blindly trust evidence, especially when human error is involved.
That's a scary thought. It just shows how important it is to have really good legal representation, both for the prosecution and the defense, to make sure that evidence is handled properly and interpreted correctly.
Absolutely. Having skilled lawyers on both sides who can present and challenge evidence effectively is crucial for a fair trial. And it's not just about the lawyers, the judge plays a vital role as well, acting as that gatekeeper to ensure that only reliable and admissible evidence makes it to the jury.
Right, which brings us back to what we were talking about earlier with the admissibility of evidence. It's ultimately the judge who decides what the jury gets to hear and see, isn't it?
That's right. They decide whether the evidence meets that four-factor test we talked about: relevance, legality, reliability, and credibility. And even if evidence is considered admissible, the judge will still instruct the jury on how to weigh that evidence, reminding them that they are the ones who ultimately decide what the facts are.
So the judge guides the process, but it's the jury who ultimately decides what they believe, how much weight to give each piece of evidence, and how it all fits together in their understanding of what happened.
Exactly. It's a system designed to make sure that the final decision, the verdict, is based on a really careful and impartial consideration of all the admissible evidence. And that's why the jury, with their diverse perspectives and experiences, are so important to our justice system.
This is fascinating stuff. It's amazing how all these different people, the lawyers, the judge, the jury, the expert witnesses, all come together in this complex process of presenting and weighing evidence. And we haven't even touched on how the media can shape public perception of these cases.
It's another layer to consider, isn't it? How the media portrays a case, what evidence they choose to focus on, that can have a huge influence on how the public sees things, and maybe even how jurors perceive the case.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that the legal system doesn't exist in some kind of bubble. It's affected by all sorts of social and cultural factors, media narratives, and even our own personal biases. It's not as simple as evidence goes in, verdict comes out.
You got it. And that's what makes this topic so interesting. Understanding how evidence works, what its limitations are, how powerful it can be, and how it can be used for both good and bad, it's essential for anyone who wants to have informed and thoughtful conversations about our legal system.
This deep dive is really making me question everything I thought I knew about evidence and how the legal process works. It's so much more nuanced and complex than I ever imagined.
And we're not done yet. We still need to explore the ethics surrounding certain types of evidence and how all these technological advances are changing the landscape of forensic science.
Can't wait to hear more. This is definitely one of those deep dives that keeps getting more and more intriguing.
Yeah.
So you mentioned how technology is changing forensic science. What are some of the advancements that are really having a big impact?
Well, one area that's just exploding right now is digital forensics. I mean, it makes sense, right?
Mm,
As we rely more and more on technology, the evidence we leave behind becomes more and more digital.
right.
So you've got experts who can now recover data from devices that have seemingly been completely wiped.
Oh.
They can analyze really complex internet browsing histories and even piece together communications from fragmented social media posts.
But like even if you hit delete, it's not really gone.
Right.
That's kind of freaky, but also really impressive.
It definitely makes you think twice about what you put out there online. And it's not just about catching criminals either.
Oh, wait.
Digital forensics is also being used to expose fraud and track down missing persons, and even to authenticate historical documents.
It's like a whole new world of evidence is opening up because of technology.
Hmm.
But with all these advancements, are there any ethical concerns that we need to be thinking about?
Oh, absolutely. For instance, the use of facial recognition technology is becoming more widespread, but it raises questions about privacy and the potential for bias.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And as DNA databases get larger and more sophisticated, we need to carefully consider the implications for things like individual rights and genetic privacy.
It's a good reminder that technology is a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad, right? It's really up to us as a society to decide how we want to use these powerful tools and to make sure that they're being used ethically.
I completely agree. We need to have open and honest discussions about the ethical implications of these new technologies and make sure we create safeguards to prevent them from being misused.
This whole deep dive has been an incredible journey. We started by talking about the different types of evidence, from the physical stuff to the digital world. Then we got into all the complexities of how evidence is deemed admissible in court and how much weight it carries. And now we're even talking about the ethical considerations surrounding forensic science.
And I think what's become clear is that the world of legal evidence is really multifaceted. It's this dynamic interplay of science and the law, human behavior, and technology.
It's definitely not as clear-cut as those crime dramas make it seem.
Not at all. And this is why it's so important for all of us to have at least a basic understanding of how evidence works, what its limitations are, and how much of an impact it can have.
I think you're right.
Because whether you're serving on a jury someday, or you're just following a high-profile case in the news, or even if you're just having discussions about justice and accountability, understanding evidence is key.
Well said. So the next time you're watching one of those courtroom dramas, don't just focus on the big speeches and the dramatic moments.
Right.
Remember all the work that goes on behind the scenes. the meticulous process of gathering, analyzing, and presenting evidence. That's the real foundation of a case and ultimately of the pursuit of justice.
It's a process that requires careful thought and critical thinking and constant awareness of the ethical implications.
This has been a truly eye-opening deep dive for me. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of how this all works. Thanks for being our guide on this fascinating journey.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, you don't have to stop here. There's tons of information out there if you want to keep exploring this topic.
Absolutely. And if you enjoyed this deep dive with us, don't forget to like and subscribe to the deep dive for more fascinating explorations into the world around us. We'll be back soon with another deep dive, ready to unpack a whole new set of intriguing topics. Until then, stay curious.